want to talk to you about something I may have mentioned before, but I want to talk about it in much more detail. And I may have mentioned that in my first big job in London, I worked for an agency which was bought by Leo Burnett, the big American agency, and I talked about meeting a man who was responsible for one of the most successful campaigns ever. And it was a campaign that made Marlboro the world's largest selling cigarette brand. I have to tell you, I confess with some embarrassment, that I've worked for a lot of cigarette companies, Gallagher, Imperial Tobacco, and when I started doing so, nobody seemed to be aware that cigarettes were very bad for you. So that's my excuse. Well, it's true, I didn't know. But let me talk to you about the Marlboro campaign, and the first thing I'm going to show, and there are many things I'm going to touch upon here. I'm going to touch upon where you get ideas from. I'm going to talk about positioning. I'm going to talk about what makes great copy. I'm going to talk about Leo Burnett. They're all important, and I hope you can gather something from them. The first thing I'm going to talk about is positioning, and what I'm going to show you first is not a Marlboro advertisement. It is an advertisement for Lucky Strike, and you'll see it says reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet. What was happening in the cigarette market at that time, we're talking about the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, was there was a great obsession with cigarettes and health, strangely enough. Whether the cigarette companies at that time knew that smoking was bad for you, I'm not at all sure. Not so long previously, people used to think that tobacco was good for you. But there was a genius running the Liggett and Myers, which made Lucky Strike, which was the #1 brand. And the line they came up with it was reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet. And if you're ever interested in reading about the great days of advertising of that period, you should read a novel called The Hucksters, which is based very largely on the relationship between the advertising agency and the client, whose name was George Washington Hill, who was one of the major shits of all time, but a brilliant advertising man. So a lot of the advertising then was focused on health. Reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet was sort of saying, if you smoke, you won't get fat. There were other advertisements, and you may have seen them. One, for instance, actually used a doctor to recommend Lucky Strike. So that was the background to all the sorts of things that were going on in the market at that time. Leo Burnett were given this brand, Marlboro, to try and see what they could do with it. It was a brand aimed at women, and it is one of the very, very rare occasions, the only one I can think of offhand, where a brand which was known for one thing was utterly transformed into something diametrically opposite, because it became the ultimate masculine cigarette. And now I'm going to show you something, and now I'm going to ramble a bit, but I hope you're listening to this, because there are quite a lot of lessons to be learned from it. I'm going to show you a picture of a cowboy. This cowboy was spotted, this picture was spotted by Leo Burnett. And Leo Burnett had a habit which I recommend to you, and which I've noticed, well, I have myself. Obviously I'm not nearly as talented as Leo Burnett was, but a lot of people that I've seen succeed, because they have these antennae out. They're always looking for something in the not at the forefront of their minds. They're always looking for things that they might be able to use in some way for their communications. I do it all the time. Anytime I see anything interesting, I'll take a photograph of it with my phone, or I'll make a note of it. And Leo Burnett saw this picture and he was interested in it, and he made a note of it. And he used to have little notebooks that he carried around with, and anytime anyone said something interesting or he saw something, he would note it down. That's where you get creative ideas from. You're always on the lookout. You're looking at everything. You're never forgetting, because a great creative idea comes, as a rule, maybe not always, but from taking two surprisingly different things and putting them together in an unexpected way. That's what makes for originality, yeah? Taking things which are familiar, but putting them together in unfamiliar ways. Okay, so Leo Burnett saw this picture, and somehow it sparked an idea to do with how they should promote Marlboro. And instead of promoting it as a woman's cigarette, they promoted it as the ultimate macho cigarette. And here's the first advertisement for Marlboro. And that is the ad that the man I met back in 1961, 62, I think it was, when I was working for Leo Burnett, when I met Draper Daniels, the man who wrote that ad. And I've commented on him in previous talks. I showed you an ad of his in the last month's talk about how a hog can cross the country without changing trains, but you can't. Now, do you see, you can look at the advertisement, you can see that it's got the emotional drive that people will identify with this cowboy, yeah? And it's also got the logical promise, the filter doesn't come between you and the flavour. I just recommend you read every word of the ad because there isn't a word wasted. And when you're selling a branded product which is available in stores, that's not the same thing as a lot of the work that you and I do, well, I've done both, where you're trying to sell something directly, where generally speaking you're trying to take people from the point of simply saying something to them to attract their attention to the point all the way through where maybe they go to a website, or maybe they ask for further information and they're actually sold the product. You should take them right the way through the purchase process. Whereas with a thing like cigarettes or detergents or things like that, if you're selling something like that, then all you're trying to do is to make sure that when people come to the point of sale, they will choose your brand, and that's what that did. And I'm going to add something to this. One of the great mistakes, perhaps the biggest mistake, which is why this story is so interesting to me, made by advertisers and marketers, is to get bored with what they do and change it, not realizing that the market is like an animal, as I often say. It's changing all the time. There are new people coming in all the time. So you don't change an approach that works because you're bored with it. You only change it when you find something better, or when something happens that makes it impossible for you to go ahead. And that's what happened in the case of the cigarette market. Increasingly, people became aware of the health risks of smoking. Increasingly, perhaps they felt that the cowboy was not as relevant as he was, and this is where I come in again. In the 1970s, I was hired by Philip Morris, who owned Marlboro, to write a film about sponsorship. And if you know anything about sponsorship, well, just in case you don't, I'm going to show you something else. Here's a car, a racing car, and you see it's got Marlboro plastered all over it. You'll have seen it many times. As it became more and more difficult to advertise conventionally, they thought, where else can we advertise? And they linked themselves to another macho figure, the racing driver, and that's what my film was about, that I made all these years ago, 30 odd years ago, 40 years ago, to explain how sponsorship worked, how they were using the racing driver in sponsorship to drive sales of Marlboro. And as far as I'm aware, Marlboro is still the world's biggest selling cigarette. So I hope you found that little sort of disquisition interesting. Above all, remember that, as you've been told many times by wiser heads than mine, that people make decisions for emotional reasons, yeah? And if they can identify with people that they want to identify with, if you can find somebody that they want to identify with, then you're onto a good thing. And I can give you lots of other examples, and I'll just end with one famous one, which built a brand which was the world's leading brand for many, many years, decades, which was Lux. And they started selling Lux more years ago than I care to contemplate, more before I was born, by associating it with film stars. Everyone wants to be associated with a film star. So they had this line, 9 out of 10 film stars choose Lux. So I'm not just talking to you about cigarettes, I'm not just talking to you about Marlboro, I'm not just talking to you about positioning, I'm talking to you about the very roots of what makes advertising work, what makes marketing work. And I'm doing this frankly because a lot of the talks that I've done so far have been about the specialised area of copy, which obviously better copy is the cheapest way to improve your results, in my view. It doesn't cost any more to run good copy than bad copy. But now I'm going to talk a little bit more as we go along about the roots of marketing success, and I hope you found that little talk interesting.